Imagine you wake up before sunrise. The fire that kept you alive through the night is almost dead. Only a few glowing embers remain beneath a layer of gray ash. You reach out your hand, and the cold bites your skin instantly. Every breath burns your lungs. The air is so cold that even speaking feels painful. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Outside your shelter, everything is silent. No birds, no insects, no flowing streams. Just snow. The landscape you hunted only a few months ago has completely disappeared beneath a blanket of white. The berries are gone, the plants are gone, even the tracks of the animals you've been following have vanished overnight. Somewhere beyond those frozen hills, food still exists, but reaching it means walking for miles through deep snow with no guarantee you'll find anything at all. If you fail, you don't just go hungry, you freeze. Today, winter is mostly an inconvenience. You put on a warm jacket, turn up the heat, and complain about scraping ice off your windshield before driving to work. If it gets too cold, you stay inside, order food, and wait for spring. For ancient humans, winter wasn't just another season. It was the most dangerous time of the entire year. Every drop in temperature meant more calories burned just to stay alive. Every failed hunt brought starvation closer. A single night without fire could mean the end of an entire family. And yet, despite having no insulated clothing, no heated homes, no supermarkets, and no weather forecasts, humans survived winters for tens of thousands of years. They crossed frozen landscapes, raised children in temperatures that would terrify most people today, and eventually spread into some of the coldest places on Earth. So, how did they do it? How did a species with thin skin, no fur, and almost no natural protection against freezing become one of the most successful survivors of the Ice Age? The answer isn't just that they were tougher than we are. It's that they changed the rules of survival completely. And it all started with one thing that no other animal on Earth had ever truly mastered. That one thing was fire. Today, fire is something you use to roast marshmallows or light a barbecue. If your stove stops working, it's annoying. You order takeout instead. But for an ancient human facing winter, losing fire wasn't an inconvenience. It could be a death sentence. Your body works best at around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or 37 degrees Celsius. It doesn't matter how strong you are. Once your core temperature starts dropping, your muscles become weaker. Your thinking slows down. Your hands stop working properly. Eventually, even the simple decision to find shelter becomes difficult. The terrifying part is that hypothermia doesn't always feel like freezing. Many people who die from it become confused. Some even feel strangely warm in their final moments. By the time they realize something is wrong, it's often too late. Ancient humans didn't know the science behind hypothermia. They didn't need to. Thousands of years of experience had already taught them one simple lesson: protect the fire. Archaeologists have discovered ancient hearths in caves and campsites across Europe and Asia, some dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Many weren't used just once. The same fireplaces were rebuilt over and over again, showing that fire had become the center of daily life. It wasn't only there for warmth. Fire transformed almost everything humans did. It dried wet clothing after snowstorms. It melted ice into drinking water. It hardened wooden spear tips. It cooked meat, making it easier to digest and allowing the body to absorb more energy. At night, it pushed back darkness and kept many predators at a distance. But perhaps the greatest challenge wasn't starting a fire, it was keeping one alive. Imagine spending hours searching frozen forests for dry wood after days of snowfall. Most branches are soaked. The ground is buried beneath snow. Every trip away from camp burns precious calories that you may never replace. If your fire goes out during a blizzard, you can't simply strike a lighter. You may have to wait until the storm ends, if you survive that long. That's why many researchers believe ancient people treated fire almost like a living companion. Someone in the group likely watched it constantly, feeding it through the night and protecting the glowing embers so the flames could be revived by morning. Because once winter arrived, fire wasn't just a tool. It became the thin line between another sunrise and never waking up again. Staying warm wasn't the hardest part of winter. Finding enough food was. Your body is like a furnace. The colder it gets outside, the more fuel that furnace burns just to keep your organs working. Even if you spend the entire day sitting still, freezing temperatures force your body to use far more energy than it would during summer. Now imagine trying to feed that furnace when almost nothing is growing. The forests that once offered berries, nuts, roots, and edible plants suddenly became almost empty. Rivers froze. Small animals disappeared into burrows. Large herds kept moving, sometimes hundreds of miles away in search of food. Every meal became a gamble. A hunting trip that failed didn't just mean going to bed hungry. It meant returning weaker than when you left. And that made tomorrow's hunt even harder. This is one reason ancient humans couldn't rely on a single source of food. They had to become incredibly flexible. If the reindeer disappeared, they hunted rabbits. If rabbits became scarce, they searched for fish beneath the ice. If the rivers froze too deeply, they cracked open bones left behind by wolves to reach the rich marrow hidden inside. Even after a predator had stripped away every piece of meat, those bones still contained fat, packed with calories. To most people today, that sounds desperate. To an ancient human, it was survival. Nothing useful was wasted. The skin became clothing, the tendons became thread, the antlers became tools, the bones became needles, spear points, and fuel. Even the fat had countless uses. Animal fat was one of the most valuable resources in winter. Gram for gram, fat contains more than twice the energy of carbohydrates or protein. In freezing weather, those extra calories could mean the difference between staying warm or slowly freezing from the inside out. But even with careful planning, food wasn't guaranteed. Some winters lasted longer than expected. Storms drove animals away. Entire hunting parties sometimes returned with nothing. And when that happened, humans relied on something even more powerful than weapons. They relied on each other. Because surviving winter was never the job of one person. It was the job of the entire group. Today, independence is something we admire. Living on your own, earning your own money, taking care of yourself. But for almost all of human history, trying to survive completely alone was one of the worst decisions you could make. Winter made that painfully obvious. Imagine waking up with a badly sprained ankle after slipping on ice. Today, you would probably rest for a few weeks, order groceries online, and visit a doctor if it didn't improve. 50,000 years ago, that same injury could leave you unable to hunt, unable to gather firewood, and unable to keep up with the group. If no one helped you, you probably wouldn't survive. This is why archaeologists have discovered something remarkable in ancient human skeletons. Some individuals lived for years with severe injuries that should have made survival impossible on their own. Broken legs that healed completely, arms that had once been shattered, missing teeth, yet evidence that the person continued living long afterward. These weren't lucky survivors. They were people who had been cared for. Someone gathered food for them. Someone kept them warm. Someone protected them until they recovered. That tells us something extraordinary. Long before cities, long before farming, even long before written language, humans had already learned one of the most powerful survival strategies on Earth: cooperation. Winter rewarded groups, not individuals. While one person searched for firewood, another repaired clothing. While experienced hunters tracked animals across the snow, others stayed behind to care for children, prepare food, and keep the fire alive. The elderly, who could no longer run after prey, still played an important role. They remembered which valleys stayed sheltered from the wind, which caves flooded during heavy snowfall, which rivers froze safely, and which ones only looked frozen. That knowledge couldn't be found anywhere else. It existed only in memory. Losing an elder didn't just mean losing a family member. It meant losing decades of survival experience. In many ways, winter became humanity's greatest teacher. It taught people that strength wasn't measured by who could lift the most, but by how well they could work together. Because when temperatures dropped below freezing, the most dangerous enemy wasn't always the cold. Sometimes, it was trying to face it alone. When most people imagine ancient humans during winter, they picture families huddled inside a dark cave while snow falls outside. It makes sense. Caves feel like the perfect shelter. They're solid, they're dry, and they block the wind. But here's the surprising part. Most ancient humans probably didn't spend their entire lives living in caves. In fact, many never had a cave nearby at all. Caves are actually quite rare. Large parts of the world simply don't have them. And even where they do exist, they weren't always safe. Some flooded after heavy snowfall. Others were already occupied by cave bears, hyenas, or big cats looking for shelter from the exact same storm. Finding an empty cave wasn't like checking into a hotel. Sometimes it meant fighting another predator for the right to survive. So humans adapted. Instead of depending on nature to build a home for them, they started building their own. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of shelters made from wooden poles, animal hides, branches, and even mammoth bones. On the cold, treeless plains of Ice Age Europe, massive mammoth bones were arranged into circular structures, then covered with hides to create surprisingly effective homes. From the outside, they may have looked simple. Inside, they were carefully designed. The entrance was often kept small so less heat could escape. Animal skins covered gaps where freezing wind could enter. The fire sat near the center, warming everyone at once while smoke slowly drifted out through openings above. Every detail mattered. A tiny crack letting in cold air could lower the temperature enough to make sleeping dangerous. A roof that leaked could soak clothing and bedding, stealing body heat throughout the night. Winter punished small mistakes. And perhaps the most valuable part of these shelters wasn't the walls, it was the people inside them. Families slept close together, sharing body heat as the fire slowly faded through the night. To us, that might sound uncomfortable. To them, it was another survival strategy. Because in the middle of an ice age, warmth wasn't something you generated alone. It was something you shared. And that simple idea helped our ancestors survive winters that would have killed almost any other primate on Earth. If you ask someone what ancient humans wore during winter, they'd probably give the same answer: animal skins. And they're not wrong, but that answer leaves out something remarkable. Simply draping a hide over your shoulders isn't enough to survive freezing temperatures. If you've ever worn a wet jacket in winter, you know how quickly cold can reach your body. Now imagine that jacket is made from fresh animal skin, still damp, still covered in fat, still stiff from the cold. It wouldn't keep you alive for long. Ancient humans had to turn those hides into real clothing. That process could take days, sometimes weeks. After a successful hunt, the skin was carefully removed and cleaned. Every scrap of meat and fat had to be scraped away before the hide began to rot. Then came one of the hardest parts: softening it. Without treatment, dried animal skin becomes stiff, almost like wood. It cracks when folded and offers very little comfort. So ancient people developed surprisingly sophisticated techniques. They stretched the hides, worked them by hand for hours, rubbed in animal brains or fat, whose natural oils helped keep the leather flexible. Finally, many hides were smoked over low fires, helping preserve them and making them more resistant to moisture. The result wasn't just a piece of fur. It was one of the earliest forms of engineered clothing. Archaeologists have even discovered tiny bone needles dating back tens of thousands of years. Not large sewing tools, tiny, carefully crafted needles with eyes for thread. That single invention changed everything. Instead of wrapping themselves in loose hides, people could stitch clothing that actually fit their bodies. Sleeves, leg coverings, boot-like footwear, hoods that trapped precious body heat around the head and neck. Layer by layer, they created insulation that worked surprisingly well against freezing winds. And clothing wasn't their only defense. They learned another trick that modern winter survival experts still recommend today: stay dry. Snow itself isn't always the biggest danger. Water is. A soaked hide loses much of its insulating ability, and wet skin pulls heat away from the body with incredible speed. Our ancestors may not have understood the physics, but they understood the outcome. If your clothes stayed dry, you had a chance. If they didn't, winter became far more dangerous. By this point, humans weren't surviving because they were physically tougher than other animals. They were surviving because they kept inventing better solutions. Every generation discovered something new: a warmer shelter, a stronger needle, a better way to preserve hides. Small improvements, repeated over thousands of years, eventually allowed a nearly hairless primate to thrive in some of the coldest places on Earth. And that ability to solve problems may have become humanity's greatest survival tool of all. By now, it might sound like ancient humans survived winter because they had fire, warm clothing, and sturdy shelters. Those things mattered, but they weren't the biggest reason our species survived. The greatest advantage humans had was something no predator could see: knowledge. Imagine two families standing at the edge of a frozen river. To both of them, the ice looks exactly the same. One family steps onto it. Minutes later, the surface cracks. The freezing water pulls them under. The other family walks a few hundred yards upstream instead. They know that section freezes first because their grandparents taught them. One decision: the difference between life and death. Winter was full of invisible dangers like this. Which berries could still be found beneath the snow? Which trees burned hottest? Which valleys trapped freezing winds? Which caves flooded when the snow melted? None of that knowledge was instinct. No baby is born knowing how to survive an ice age. Every lesson had to be learned, often through painful mistakes, and then passed to the next generation. This is where humans became different from almost every other animal. A wolf pup learns mostly by watching its pack, but humans went much further. They could explain, demonstrate, correct mistakes, tell stories about hunts that happened years ago, warn children about places they'd never visited. One successful winter didn't disappear when the people who experienced it died. Their knowledge survived with them, and over thousands of years, that knowledge accumulated. Each generation inherited thousands of tiny survival lessons: how to keep embers alive beneath ash, how to read fresh snow without losing the trail, how to store food where predators couldn't smell it, how to recognize the first signs of frostbite before fingers turned black. No single discovery changed human history overnight, but together, those small pieces of knowledge became more powerful than sharper teeth, stronger muscles, or thicker fur. Because every winter our ancestors survived made them slightly better prepared for the next one, and eventually, those lessons allowed humans to do something that almost seemed impossible. They didn't just survive winter, they expanded into it. They crossed frozen mountains, followed animals across icy plains, and settled lands where temperatures dropped far below anything our earliest ancestors in Africa had ever experienced. In the end, winter didn't defeat humanity, it shaped it. The cold forced us to cooperate. Scarcity forced us to plan. Danger forced us to innovate. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of all. The species that should have been one of the least prepared for freezing climates ended up conquering nearly every environment on Earth. Not because we were the strongest animals, but because we learned, adapted, and refused to stop improving. The next time you zip up a winter jacket, turn on your heater, or step inside a warm home while snow falls outside, remember this. For thousands of generations, every warm winter you've ever experienced exists because someone, long ago, figured out how to survive a cold one.